Hi everybody, welcome to our next lesson in the evolution unit. Today we're going to be looking at three of the evolutionary processes. We're going to look at natural selection, artificial selection, and sexual selection. But before we get started, I want you to make sure that you have your note downloaded or printed out so that you can edit it and add our definitions and ideas so that you have something to review later. And I also want to remind you that when she pops up on the screen, that's a signal for you to pause our video and write down what we just talked about, or write down a definition that's on the screen that corresponds with your sheet so that you follow along and make sure that you have all the important concepts written down for you for later. So the first concept that I want to explore is the idea of natural selection. If you remember our video about the theorists who helped to develop the theory of evolution, you'll remember Charles Darwin, who realized the process of evolution from his research. Natural selection is the process where individuals who are better adapted to their environment tend to survive, reproduce, and pass on their desired traits to their offspring. When I say desired traits, I mean characteristics that give an organism an advantage to make them better survivors that can reproduce. It's the idea of survival of the fittest. So individuals who are more fit to their environment are able to survive longer and have the opportunity to reproduce and pass on their traits. So, for example, let's say a bird likes eating ladybugs. So on the tree branch, there's red ladybugs and there's orange ladybugs. And if the bird likes the red ones more, then that means that being orange is a desired trait because you have less of a chance of being eaten by a predator. Since the red ladybugs are being eaten more often, they have less of a chance to reproduce and pass on their red genes to the offspring. But the orange ones can reproduce, and eventually this will be more common in the ladybug population. So there are three components to natural selection that need to take place in order for the process of natural selection to carry out. The first one is variation, which means that individuals must be different from one another in a population. The second one is inheritance, meaning that some differences in the population are due to varying traits that are being passed on from parent to offspring. So the offspring are inheriting traits from their parents. And the third one is differentiated reproductive success, where certain traits are more successful at surviving and reproducing compared to other traits. So that whole idea that I was talking about with desired traits versus undesirable traits, the desired traits are more successful at reproducing compared to the undesirable traits. So these three components, like I said, they need to take place in order for natural selection to take place. And I have a really cool video for you to watch about the rock pocket mouse. And this video shows a really cool real-life example of natural selection affecting the fur color on mice based on the environment that they live in. So a quick disclaimer, there is footage of a bird eating one of the mice, and it's kind of graphic. So if that bothers you, then please look away or fast forward. But other than that, let's take a look.
Across the American Southwest, golden deserts dotted by cacti and brush stretch for miles. Yet here in New Mexico's Valley of Fire, the landscape changes dramatically. Patches of black rock interrupt the sand, remnants of volcanic eruptions that occurred about 1,000 years ago. The eruptions spewed a river of lava more than 40 miles long across the desert. As the molten rock cooled, it darkened, leaving any creature dependent upon camouflage in serious trouble. In the complex battle of life, one of the constant struggles is between seeing and not being seen, the evolutionary game of hide and seek. And we've come here to the Valley of Fire in New Mexico, a battlefield, to find one of the tiniest soldiers and what it can teach us about how evolution works. On the desert sands, the rock pocket mouse blends in perfectly, its light-colored fur concealing it from predators. But on dark lava, the same fur makes the mouse stand out, attracting the many creatures that see it as food.
These mice are the Snickers bar of the desert. They're eaten by foxes and coyotes and rattlesnakes, and certainly by owls, and maybe even occasionally hawks. And most of those predators are visual predators.
So what happened to the pocket mice that found themselves on this new terrain? When I accompany biologist Michael Nachman onto the lava, it doesn't take long to find out.
Oh, this one's closed.
Nachman has been collecting mice unharmed in traps. And it's a dark one.
It is, yeah.
Now, are most of the ones you find up here dark?
Almost all of them.
Not only have the mice here evolved to be as dark as the rock,
Shake them into the bag.
the color change has occurred precisely where it will conceal them from hunters. Now, a bit of a white underbelly, too.
That's right. All of the dark ones here and on other lava flows have a white underbelly, and presumably there's no selection for dark on the belly because predators are coming from above.
Left to themselves, the mice show no preference for light or dark rocks. It's the predators that have made the difference.
The change in color over evolutionary time in the population is driven by predators weeding out the mice that don't match their background.
But how did the dark mice arise in the first place?
When a black mouse appears in a light population of mice, that is usually going to be due to a new mutation. And those are random and rare events.
To fully understand the pocket mouse transformation, Nachman moves from the lava to the lab. He and his team extract DNA from light and dark mice taken from one desert region. The aim? To find one or more genetic mutations that cause dark coloration. A mutation is a change in the chemical letters that make up our genes. It's a copying error that may occur when our cells divide. Mutation seems to mean that something bad has happened. Well, mutations are neither good or bad. Whether they are favored or whether they are rejected or whether they're just neutral depends upon the conditions an organism finds itself. So for the pocket mouse, a mutation that caused the mouse to turn black, that is good if you're living on black rock, it's bad if you're living out in the sandy desert.
The light mice are all on the bottom, here.
Fur color is a trait controlled by many genes. To figure out how dark mice evolved, Nachman focuses on how these genes differ in dark and light mice. One by one, the genes prove identical, but at last, something does turn up. The difference between dark and light mice boils down to a difference of 4 chemical letters in a gene called MC1R. Because the gene controls the amount of dark pigment in a mouse's hair follicles, a mouse with these mutations grows dark fur, which gives it an advantage on a dark background. But still, that's one mouse. How would its dark fur spread to a whole population?
This lava flow is about 1,000 years old. And so you might wonder, has there been enough time? It's only been 1,000 years. It's a very short period of time for a new mutation to come along and spread, and so that all of the mice on this lava flow are black, because really they all are.
Indeed, such a rapid spread of a mutation may seem unlikely until you do the math. And the reason is that while only one new mouse born in 100,000 may be black, hundreds of thousands of mice are born in any given year. And then those mice that are black have enough advantage that their babies do better, and they have more offspring, and their offspring have more offspring. And just about a 5% advantage, compounded year in and year out, can very quickly turn the whole population black, as we see today. If dark color gives mice a 1% competitive advantage, and you start with 1% of the population being dark, then about 1,000 years, 95% of the mice will be dark. If instead, the dark color gives them a 10% advantage, then it only takes 100 years. Thanks to Nachman's mice, science has an example of evolution crystal clear in every detail.
What's exciting about this is that we have a system that's very simple ecologically. You have dark rocks and you have light rocks, and you have dark mice and light mice. It couldn't be simpler.
We know who the predators are, what the selective force is. We know precisely the genetic basis of what makes the mice have an advantage or a disadvantage depending upon where they live. All the pieces are finally together. It's a perfect illustration of Darwin's process of natural selection. In fact, it's more than that. For Nachman's mice also counter a common misconception that evolution is a random process. Well, there is one random component, and that's the process of mutation. Mutations occur at random throughout our DNA. Every new organism is born with a new set of mutations. But while mutation is random, natural selection is not. Natural selection sorts out the winners and losers. And that's really what the whole process of evolution is driven by. But if natural selection is not random, would it produce the same result under the same conditions? It does. And here's proof. Rock pocket mice collected by Nachman from other lava flows in other parts of the Southwest.
These are two different black mice, and they each evolved on different lava flows. And the lava flows are hundreds of miles apart. But the changes, the genetic changes that made these mice black, were different in each case. And what's amazing to me is how similar the black mice are. We didn't know when we started this whether we would find that there were the same genes or different genes, and we were really surprised to find that they were completely different genes, and yet if you look at the mice, they look almost identical.
The rock pocket mice show us that evolution can and does repeat itself, and why evolutionary change is never ending. As environments transform, so must the species that inhabit them, adapting and readapting in the great and complex battle of life.
Darwin also talked about descent with modification in his theory, which is the idea that all species descend from a common ancestor and that modifications have taken place over time. So species, due to natural selection, have developed new structures or they've taken on new feeding niches, such as Darwin's finches, who adapted their beak size and shape to be able to eat the food available on their separate islands. And these developments have come from an ancestor, instead of a new species just popping up out of nowhere. To put that into perspective, if we accepted the idea that species develop without a common ancestor, we could expect a new species of lion to just show up on the savanna. Instead of a lion that looks similar to those that are already present, maybe a light brown, we would see a random black lion roaming around, which is much more unrealistic than the finches who would have had an ancestor that had one beak size and shape, but when the finches spread out to the other Galapagos Islands, they found that that ancestor's beak was not always effective at picking up the seeds or the insects on that specific island. So the different populations had to make modifications over generations and over an extended period of time, and eventually the ancestor's beak developed into a new version that better suited the environment and the feeding pattern for those individuals. So that's natural selection in a nutshell. And now we're going to explore artificial selection. Artificial selection is also called selective breeding, and it is the process in which humans choose the most desirable traits and breed individuals in a population who have these characteristics to ensure that the offspring will inherit these desirable traits. They don't breed undesirable individuals, with the goal being to lose the undesired traits in the gene pool so that it can't be passed on anymore. And typically, artificial selection is for human benefit. So farmers are a great example of humans who actively use artificial selection. If you want to produce the best livestock, you want to breed the fattest hogs so that the buyer will be happy with your product and come back to buy more. Or you want to breed the cows that produce the most and the best quality of milk to sell more high-quality products. This often happens in horse racing too, where breeders will breed the faster horses in an attempt to produce a champion offspring. Dog breeding is another common example where humans choose the breeds they like and cross them, such as a poodle mating with a golden retriever to produce golden doodle puppies. Crops and plants are other great examples of artificial selection, where fruits like strawberries that grow bigger, juicier berries will be bred, or their seeds will be used to create bigger strawberry bushes to sell and make a better profit. Humans have been able to develop other produce, such as seedless oranges and grapes, by using artificial selection. And the take-home message about artificial selection that you need to remember is that it involves human intervention, and it is typically for human benefit. So natural selection is because of nature. Artificial selection is because humans have actively chosen who mates with who to produce an offspring. Our third and final evolutionary process for this video is sexual selection. Sexual selection occurs during mating, where individuals compete for the other sex, and selection is made through one sex preferring certain characteristics found in the opposite sex. For example, in some fish species, the male has brighter spots to attract the female, so the female fish would select her mate based on the male with the brighter spots. The competition usually occurs between males competing for females, but females can also compete for males, or both sexes can compete for each other. This is an important process for passing on genes because those who mate are the only ones who can reproduce and pass on their genes. So it's important to have those bright spots so that you can keep your genes in the population. I have a few sexual selection examples to show you. The first one is two red deer males fighting for the female. They use their antler racks to show strength to impress her, and the bighorn rams also use this tactic where they actually square off and smash into one another.
The older ram seems to walk away in submission. But his posture is known as the low stretch. It means, you want a piece of me? Come get it. The force of the impact, delivered at 35 kilometers per hour, is enough to kill a human instantly. Two layers of skull protect their brains. The fight lasts for hours, each ram battering the other dozens of times.
Birds have extremely interesting sexual selection mechanisms. Some birds have a mating call, some have a dance, and some males have impressive coloration to attract the female. Here we see the male peacock dancing and trying to woo the female with his large, colorful tail feathers.
The male carries all the weight in these encounters. It is he who has to impress, because his chances are only as good as his tail.
It's the male peacock who has the long, showy tail, but it's really female choosiness that's driven the evolution of that tail.
Peafowl think the more impressive the tail, the better the genes they'll pass on to their young.
Now we have the bird of paradise doing an interesting dance to try to impress the female.
The superb bird of paradise calls to attract the female. And he has more luck. But what does he have to do to really impress her? she retires to consider her verdict. It's hard not to feel deflated when even your best isn't good enough.
And finally, this is one of the coolest nature videos I have ever seen. We have a lyrebird who can imitate sounds around him, and he uses his voice to attract the female. He is absolutely amazing. Wasn't that crazy? It's also important to note that sexual selection increases mating success, not necessarily survival. There are often trade-offs to these characteristics, such as having a large rack of antlers is very heavy to carry around, especially if you're running from a predator. Or the fish with bright spots would also be more noticeable to their predators. So while you're attracting the female, you're also attracting predators. So there's this trade-off between survival and passing on your genes. Sexual dimorphism is when there are noticeable differences in appearance between the males and the females of the same species. An example of this could be lions, where the male has a large mane and the female doesn't. The elephant seal male has a much larger snout and is physically a lot larger than the female. The male mallard has much more coloration, whereas the female is usually just brown. Or we can see in orangutans where the male has noticeably bigger hands, his body's bigger, he's a little bit hairier, and especially the differences in their face structure. That wraps up our lesson for today. Please finish our note with the matching activity at the bottom. I've also attached a natural selection activity on the lesson page, and I invite you to work through this activity, answer the questions, and then check your answers with my answer key to make sure that you understand the concepts that we just talked about today. I've also attached a video of male kangaroos fighting to show dominance and strength to impress the female. I would definitely check that out. It's a pretty cool video. As well as a video of male crabs trying to court the females and other helpful videos to extend your exploration on these processes. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope this helped your understanding of the 3 evolutionary processes, and I will see you soon.